The great doors of the hall swung open before Ethan Cole had even lowered his hand from the frame, and the noise inside seemed to fall away in waves, one row of nobles after another turning to look at the man who had just saved their city. He walked forward with his armor still marked from the fighting, dust caught in the creases of the metal, his boots leaving faint prints on the polished floor. He had not slept in 2 days. He had not eaten since the morning before. But he walked with his back straight, because that was what a soldier did, even when his legs wanted to give out beneath him. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised chair that was not quite a throne but wanted to be, sat Charlotte Vane. She watched him approach with an expression that gave nothing away, her fingers laced together on her lap, her chin tilted at an angle that made her look as though she were studying something beneath her, rather than a man who had just returned from defending everything she owned. Ethan stopped before her and bowed, the way custom required, though his knees ached with the effort. "The eastern wall held," he said. "The raiders have been pushed back past the river. Your family's land is safe." He expected silence, or perhaps a word of thanks, something small, something that acknowledged the men who had not come home. Instead, Charlotte rose from her chair, walked down the 3 shallow steps that separated her from the hall floor, and studied him, the way a merchant studies a horse she has already decided not to buy. "You call that victory," she said. "Half the eastern fields are burned. My grandfather's orchard is gone. And you stand here covered in dirt, expecting me to fall at your feet, because you managed to survive." The hall had gone entirely quiet now. Even the servants near the walls seemed to be holding their breath. "My lady," Ethan said carefully, "I lost 11 men in that field. I would not call it a small thing." 11 men, Charlotte repeated, and there was something sharp in the way she said it, something that turned the number into an accusation rather than a loss. 11 men who were paid to be there. Do not stand in my hall and ask for gratitude because a job was done, and done poorly at that. You want to be thanked for burned orchards and broken fences? You want a medal for a battle that should never have reached my land in the first place? Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his face still. He had faced worse than words before. He told himself that. He had faced blades and fire, and the screaming of men who would not see morning, and he had walked through all of it without breaking. Words, he thought, were nothing compared to that. He was wrong, though he did not know it yet. "The raiders came from the North Pass," he said. "No one could have predicted the size of their force. We held the wall. We held the city." "That is what matters. That is what matters to you," Charlotte said, "because you are a soldier, and soldiers measure their worth in survival. I measure mine in what is left standing, and what is left standing, Ethan Cole, is very little." She began to walk a slow circle around him, the way a teacher circles a student who has failed to learn a simple lesson, and the nobles in the hall watched with the particular hunger of people who enjoy watching someone else be taken apart in public. "They tell me you grew up with nothing," Charlotte said. "An orphan, raised on scraps and borrowed steel, taught to fight by men who had nothing better to do with you. They tell me you clawed your way into that armor, rank by rank, as though that were something to be proud of. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who has spent his whole life trying to prove he belongs somewhere he was never invited. My lady, I am not finished," she said, and her voice did not rise, which somehow made it worse. A raised voice could be dismissed as anger. This was something colder. "You wear that armor like it means something, like the scratches on it are stories worth telling. But do you know what I hear when men speak of you in this court? I hear pity. I hear people saying, 'Poor Ethan Cole, fighting so hard for a world that will never see him as anything more than a blade to be used and put away.' You are not a hero in this hall. You are a tool, and tools do not get thanked. They get sharpened, and used again, until they break." The words landed harder than any blow he had taken in the field that week. He had been struck before, cut before, thrown from his horse and dragged through mud with an arrow lodged in his shoulder, and none of it had ever made him feel the way he felt standing in that hall, in front of everyone, being told exactly what he had always feared was true. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like begging, and he had never begged for anything in his life. Charlotte stopped circling and stood in front of him again, close enough that he could see the faint satisfaction behind her eyes, the look of someone who had aimed carefully and hit exactly where she intended. "Go clean yourself up," she said, as though dismissing a servant. "You smell of smoke, and you are dripping on my floor." She turned and walked back up the steps to her chair without waiting for a response, and the hall slowly began to fill with quiet conversation again, as though nothing unusual had happened, as though a woman had not just stood in front of a man who had bled for her family and told him he was nothing more than a broken tool waiting to be used again. Ethan stood there a moment longer than he should have. Then he turned and walked out of the hall, past the guards who would not meet his eyes, past the servants who suddenly found reasons to be looking anywhere but at him, and out into the cold evening air, where the sound of the closing doors behind him felt louder than any battle he had ever fought. He did not go to his quarters. He did not go to the healers, though his shoulders still ached from where a blade had caught him 3 days before. He walked instead to the low wall at the edge of the courtyard, where the noise of the hall could not reach him, and he stood there with his hands resting on the cold stone, staring out at the darkening hills where his men had fought, and where some of them had died. 11 men, he thought. Their names moved through his mind one after another, quiet and steady, the way he always counted them when the fighting was over. He had known each one. He had trained some of them himself. He had promised their families, in the quiet way a commander promises without ever saying the words aloud, that he would bring them home, and he had failed 11 times. And now the woman whose land they had died defending stood in her hall and called it a job poorly done. He did not cry. He had trained himself long ago not to, the way a man trains himself not to flinch when a blade comes close. But something in his chest had gone very still, the way a lake goes still before a storm, and he stood at that wall until the last of the light disappeared behind the hills, and the cold had worked its way fully into his bones. Behind him, unseen in the shadow of a doorway, a young guard named Oliver Hastings watched him for a long moment before quietly turning away, deciding it was not his place to speak to a man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the entire sky on his shoulders. Ethan finally turned from the wall and walked toward the barracks, his armor still heavy on his body, each step slower than the last, though nothing about the ground had changed. It was not his legs that had grown tired. It was something else, something that no rest would fix, something that had cracked quietly in that hall in front of everyone and had not yet finished falling apart. He passed a group of soldiers near the training yard, men who had fought beside him only days before, and they straightened when they saw him, offering the small nods of respect that soldiers give their commander. He returned the gesture out of habit, though his mind was somewhere far away, replaying the words again and again, turning them over like stones in his palm, searching for the edge that had cut so deep. A tool, sharpened, and used again, until it breaks. He reached his quarters and closed the door behind him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not immediately begin the ritual of cleaning his armor, checking his blade, preparing for whatever came next. He simply stood in the small, dim room, listening to his own breathing, feeling the strange, hollow silence that had settled where his resolve used to be. Outside, the camp continued its usual evening rhythm, fires being lit, voices calling out orders, and jokes in equal measure, the ordinary sounds of a life he had built for himself out of nothing. He had always found comfort in that sound before. Tonight, it felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else's life, someone who had not just been told, in front of an entire hall of people, that everything he had built meant nothing at all. He sat down on the edge of his narrow bed, still in his armor, and for a long while he did not move. Somewhere in the hall he had just left, Charlotte Vane was already speaking with her advisors about repairs to the orchard, the eastern wall, the cost of rebuilding what the raiders had burned. She had already moved on. The words she had spoken, so carefully aimed, so precisely cruel, had cost her nothing at all. For Ethan Cole, they would cost everything. Morning came without offering him any relief. Ethan Cole had not slept, though he had lain still on his bed for most of the night, staring at the wooden beams above him, listening to the wind move against the shutters. He rose before the sun was fully up, as he always did, and for a moment his body moved through the familiar motions of preparing for the day out of pure habit, reaching for the cloth to polish his breastplate, checking the straps on his boots, running his thumb along the edge of his blade to test it for nicks. Then he stopped, halfway through the motion, and simply sat there holding the cloth in his hand, wondering why he was doing any of it at all. A knock came at his door not long after, sharp and familiar. He opened it to find Nolan Hart standing there, his old commander and closest friend, a man who had trained him since he was a boy too small to lift a real sword, and had watched him grow into someone the whole kingdom now depended on. "You look terrible," Nolan said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited, which was his way. "Worse than after the river crossing, and that time you'd actually been stabbed." "I'm fine," Ethan said, which was not true, and both of them knew it. Nolan studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing the way they did when he was reading a situation the way he read a battlefield, searching for the detail that explained everything else. "Word travels fast in this keep," he said finally. "I heard what happened in the hall." Ethan did not answer. He turned away and began, out of habit, to fold a blanket that did not need folding. "She had no right to speak to you that way," Nolan said. 11 men gave their lives holding that wall. You gave 2 days without sleep, and took a blade to the shoulder doing it. If anyone in this keep owes gratitude, it is her family, not the other way around." "She said I was a tool," Ethan said quietly, still not turning around. "Sharpened and used until I break." Nolan was silent for a moment. She was wrong. Was she? Ethan finally turned to face him, and there was something in his expression that Nolan had never seen before, not even in the worst of their campaigns, not even the time they had both nearly died crossing the frozen pass 3 winters ago. "I have no family name that means anything. I have no land, no title, nothing but the armor on my back, and the rank I earned by bleeding for people who will never see me as anything more than useful." She simply said the thing that everyone else has always been too polite to say. "That's not true, and you know it," Nolan said firmly. "The men who serve under you would follow you into fire without a second thought. The people of this city sleep peacefully because of what you do. That is not the life of a tool. That is the life of a man who matters." Ethan managed a small, humorless smile. "Tools matter too, Nolan. Right up until they're not useful anymore." Nolan opened his mouth to argue further, but something in Ethan's face told him the conversation had already reached its limit, that further words would only be turned aside the way a blade slides off well-made armor. He clasped Ethan's shoulder instead, the way he had done 100 times before, and left the room without saying anything more. Ethan spent the rest of that day in a strange, quiet distance from everything around him. He walked the training grounds and watched the younger soldiers practice their forms, and though his eyes followed their movements, his mind kept drifting back to the hall, to the sound of Charlotte's voice, calm and precise, cutting him apart piece by piece in front of everyone he worked with. He thought of his childhood, though he rarely allowed himself to. He remembered the cold nights in the orphan house near the eastern quarter of the city, where boys with no families slept 3 to a bed to share what little warmth they could find. He remembered the old soldier, a retired veteran named Peter Wren, who had taken pity on a scrawny boy who kept sneaking into the training yard to watch the recruits practice, and who had eventually agreed, half in amusement and half in genuine interest, to teach him the basics himself. He remembered every year after that as a kind of climb, each rank earned through effort that left him bruised and exhausted, each promotion met not with celebration, but with the quiet understanding that he would simply need to work harder than everyone else, because he did not have a name that opened doors the way other names did. He had told himself for years that it did not matter, that the work itself was the reward, that skill and loyalty would eventually be enough. Charlotte's words had reached directly into that carefully built belief and pulled it apart in a matter of seconds. By evening, Ethan found himself back at the low wall at the edge of the courtyard, the same place he had stood the night before, watching the hills fade into darkness. He did not know how long he stood there before he heard footsteps behind him, light and careful, and turned to find a young woman he did not immediately recognize. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "My name is Grace Miller. I work in the kitchens. I saw what happened in the hall yesterday." Ethan straightened slightly, unused to being approached by someone he did not know, especially about something so personal. "It's not something I wish to discuss." "I understand," Grace said gently. "I only wanted to say that not everyone in this keep agrees with what was said to you. Many of us were angry on your behalf. Some of the kitchen staff even spoke of refusing to serve at the next feast. though I doubt anything will come of it. People talk more than they act, especially when their livelihoods depend on staying quiet. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, surprised by the honesty in her words. Why tell me this? Grace shrugged, a simple, unguarded gesture. Because I think sometimes people need to hear that they are seen, even when the person who should be thanking them chooses instead to tear them down. You held that wall. My brother served under you in the Eastern Company. He came home because of decisions you made under pressure that most people could never handle. That matters to my family, even if it means nothing to Lady Vane. For the first time since the hall, something in Ethan's chest loosened slightly, though the ache Charlotte's words had left behind did not disappear. He thanked Grace quietly, and she left him alone at the wall, disappearing back toward the kitchens with the same quiet steps she had arrived with. Alone again, Ethan turned his thoughts over slowly, trying to weigh Grace's words against Charlotte's, trying to understand why one stranger's kindness could not undo what one noblewoman's cruelty had done. He realized, standing there in the cold, that it was not simply about the words themselves. It was about what they had confirmed, the fear he had carried quietly since he was a boy, watching other children get chosen first, get named as heirs to something, while he stood at the edge of every room he entered, waiting to be given permission to belong. Charlotte had not created that fear. She had simply found it, precisely, and pressed against it until it broke open. Over the following days, Ethan continued his duties as though nothing had changed, training his soldiers, reviewing reports from the Eastern Wall, meeting with Nolan and the other commanders to plan repairs and reinforcements. But something beneath the surface had shifted, quietly and steadily, like a crack spreading through stone, that would eventually give way without warning. He began, almost without noticing at first, to remove pieces of his armor when he was alone in his quarters at night. Not out of any decision, not yet, but simply because the weight of it had started to feel unbearable in a way it never had before. Even after the longest campaigns, he would sit on the edge of his bed, with his breastplate resting beside him, staring at the scratches and dents that marked years of service, and wonder, for the first time in his life, what all of it had actually earned him. One evening, nearly a week after the incident in the hall, Nolan found him in exactly that position, sitting quietly with his armor removed and set aside, staring at nothing in particular. You've been different since that day, Nolan said, sitting down across from him without being asked. I've known you since you were a boy who couldn't lift a training sword without falling over. I've never seen you like this. I keep thinking about what she said, Ethan admitted quietly. Not the insult itself, the truth underneath it. I have spent my whole life trying to prove that I belong somewhere, and I have never once stopped to ask myself whether the place I was trying to belong to was ever worth the effort. Nolan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. And what have you decided? Ethan looked down at the armor beside him, running his fingers slowly along one dented edge. I don't know yet, but I know that something in me has changed, and I don't think I can go back to how things were before. Nolan did not press further. He simply sat with his friend in the quiet room, the way he had sat with him through countless nights before battles, offering nothing but his presence, understanding that some things could not be fixed with words, only endured, until a decision revealed itself on its own. Neither of them knew yet how soon that decision would come, or how completely it would change everything that followed. The War Council met on a gray morning, the kind of morning where the sky refused to decide between rain and clear skies, and the great hall felt colder than usual despite the fires burning in every hearth along its walls. Nobles and commanders alike gathered around the long table at its center, maps spread out before them showing the eastern territories, the burned fields, the positions where the raiders had last been seen retreating past the river. Charlotte Vane sat near the head of the table, dressed in deep green, her expression composed and businesslike, already deep in discussion with her steward about the cost of rebuilding the orchard. She did not look up when the doors opened, assuming it was another servant bringing reports. The room went quiet all at once, the way a room does when something unexpected enters it, and Charlotte finally lifted her eyes to see what had caused the silence. Ethan Cole stood in the doorway, and for a moment, nobody in the hall seemed to understand what they were looking at. He wore no armor, no breastplate, no gauntlets, no sword at his hip. He was dressed instead in simple traveling clothes, a plain gray tunic, and a worn leather jacket, the kind of clothing a common tradesman might wear on the road. Without his armor, he looked smaller somehow, though nothing about his height or build had changed. It was as though the armor had always carried a kind of authority with it, and without it, he stood there as simply a man, nothing more and nothing less. "Commander Cole," said Nolan, half rising from his seat, clearly as surprised as everyone else in the room. "What is the meaning of this?" Ethan walked forward, his steps steady and unhurried, until he stood at the center of the table where everyone could see him clearly. He set down a folded piece of cloth on the table's surface, and when he unwrapped it, the room saw his commander's insignia resting inside, the silver emblem that marked his rank, along with his sword, laid carefully across the fabric. "I am resigning my commission," he said simply. The words landed in the hall, like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of murmured shock spreading outward from where he stood. Several nobles exchanged glances. A few of the older commanders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something significant was happening, but not yet understanding its shape. Charlotte's face, for the first time since Ethan had known her, showed something other than composed control. Her eyes widened slightly, and though she quickly gathered herself, the surprise lingered at the edges of her expression. "You cannot simply resign," she said, her voice carrying the sharp authority she always used, though there was something uncertain beneath it now. "The eastern defenses depend on your leadership. The raiders have not been fully driven back. This is not the time for—" "With respect, my lady," Ethan interrupted, calm and steady. "You made it very clear last week what you think of my leadership. You called me a tool, sharpened and used until I break. I have thought about those words every day since you spoke them, and I have come to a conclusion I believe you will find satisfying, given your opinion of my worth." The hall had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on the exchange unfolding at its center. "A tool does not choose where it is used," Ethan continued. "It has no say in the matter. It is picked up, sharpened, worked until it is no longer useful, and then discarded without ceremony. I have spent my entire life allowing myself to be treated exactly that way, believing that if I simply worked hard enough, bled enough, sacrificed enough, I would eventually earn something more than that. I understand now that I was wrong. No amount of loyalty changes how a person is seen by those who have already decided what they are worth." Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but for once, no words came immediately. "I am not a tool," Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the silent hall, "and I will no longer wear armor for people who see me as one. A warrior's armor exists to protect what is worth protecting. If my service means nothing to the people I protect, then the armor means nothing either. I would rather walk away with my dignity intact than continue serving in a place that has already told me, quite clearly, exactly how little I am valued." He turned to Nolan, who was watching him with an expression caught somewhere between pride and deep sorrow. "You have trained good officers, Nolan. Any one of them can take command of the Eastern Company. They do not need me specifically. They need someone willing to lead, and there are others capable of that." "Ethan," Nolan said quietly, "think about this. You cannot simply throw away everything you have built because of one conversation." "It is not one conversation," Ethan said, turning back to look at Charlotte directly. "It is every conversation I have had in this keep since the day I first put on that armor. It is every time I have been reminded, in ways large and small, that no matter what I achieve, I will always be seen as something less than the people I serve." Lady Vane simply said it more plainly than most people bother to. Charlotte rose from her seat now, something flickering across her face that might have been anger, or might have been something closer to alarm, though she seemed unwilling to name it either way. "You are being dramatic," she said. "One difficult conversation does not undo years of service. This is not honor, Ethan Cole. This is pride." "Perhaps it is both," Ethan said, "but it is my pride to spend as I choose, and I choose to spend it walking away, rather than continuing to serve people who see nothing worth respecting in me." He looked around the hall one final time, at the faces of soldiers he had led into battle, at nobles who had never once bothered to learn his history, beyond the fact that he had none worth mentioning, and at Charlotte Vane, still standing near the head of the table, her composed mask slipping further with every passing second. "The eastern wall will hold," he said finally, addressing the room as a whole, rather than any single person within it. I have trained good soldiers, and they do not need my name attached to their success, for that success to matter. I wish this kingdom well. I simply cannot continue to be part of it in this way. He turned and walked toward the doors, his steps unhurried, his back straight in exactly the way it had always been, though now there was no armor to explain the posture, only the simple resolve of a man who had made his decision and did not intend to look back. "Wait," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmuring hall, sharper than she perhaps intended. Ethan paused, though he did not turn around. "You cannot simply leave. The Eastern Territories are still vulnerable. If the raiders return before a new commander is properly established, the consequences will fall on everyone, including the very soldiers you claim to care about." Ethan finally turned, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy passed across his face. "Then perhaps, my lady, you should have considered that before you decided my sacrifices were worth mocking in front of your entire court. I trained good officers. I have faith they will rise to the challenge. Whether the transition is smooth or difficult is no longer something I intend to concern myself with." He walked out of the hall, and this time, no one called after him. The doors closed behind him with a heavy, final sound, and for a long moment, the entire hall remained silent, the shock of what had just happened settling over everyone present. Nolan sat back down slowly, staring at the folded cloth still resting on the table, the insignia and sword left behind like relics of a life that had just, quite deliberately, been set aside. Charlotte remained standing, her hands pressed flat against the table's surface, staring at the closed doors with an expression that none of the assembled nobles had ever seen on her face before. It was not quite anger, it was something closer to the particular, unsettled feeling of realizing that words spoken carelessly, in a moment of superiority, could carry consequences far beyond what had ever been intended. Outside, Ethan Cole walked through the courtyard, past the training yard where soldiers paused their drills to watch him pass, past the barracks where he had lived for more years than he could easily count, and toward the main gate of the keep, where a single horse waited, already saddled with the small collection of belongings he had gathered that morning, while the rest of the keep slept. He did not look back at the keep as he mounted the horse. He did not look back at the walls he had defended, the training grounds where he had shaped so many young soldiers into capable fighters, or the hall where his entire life had been reduced, in a matter of minutes, to a handful of cruel and precise sentences. He rode out through the gate as the gray morning finally decided to release its rain, thin and cold, soaking through his simple traveling clothes within minutes. He did not turn back. He did not slow his pace. He rode toward the horizon with nothing but the horse beneath him and the quiet, aching relief of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of trying to earn his place, chosen instead to simply walk away from it. Behind him, the keep continued its business, though something in its rhythm felt disrupted, as though a piece of its foundation had quietly been removed, and no one yet knew how much weight that piece had actually been carrying. Word spread quickly among the soldiers, among the kitchen staff, among the servants and the guards, who had watched Ethan Cole walk the halls of that keep for over a decade. By evening, nearly everyone within the walls had heard some version of the story, and opinions split sharply between those who thought he had acted rashly and those who believed, quietly and without saying so where Charlotte Vane might hear, that he had done exactly what he should have done. Grace Miller heard the news in the kitchens, from another servant, who had heard it from a guard who had witnessed the entire scene. She said nothing when she heard it, but she thought of the man she had spoken to at the courtyard wall, only days before, and she hoped, in a way she could not quite explain, that wherever he was riding to, he would find something better waiting for him than what he had left behind. Nolan Hart spent that evening alone in his quarters, staring at Ethan's old armor, which had been quietly returned to storage, along with his insignia and sword, relics now of a service that had ended not with celebration or ceremony, but with quiet, deliberate resignation. He thought of the boy he had first trained years ago, too small to lift a sword properly, and the man that boy had become, and he wondered, with a heaviness he could not quite shake, whether the kingdom had just made a mistake it would not fully understand, until it was far too late to correct. 3 weeks after Ethan Cole rode out through the main gate, the Eastern Territories began to feel the absence of his leadership in ways no one had fully anticipated. The new commander appointed to oversee the wall, a capable young officer named Felix Grant, worked hard and followed every procedure exactly as he had been trained, but the soldiers under his command noticed the difference immediately, in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Ethan had always known his soldiers by name. He had known which ones struggled with doubt before a fight, and which ones needed a firm word rather than a gentle one, which ones fought better in silence, and which ones needed to talk through their fear before facing it. Felix knew none of this. He knew formations and strategy, but he did not know the people who carried out that strategy, and in the tense weeks following Ethan's departure, that difference began to matter more than anyone had expected. When a smaller group of raiders tested the eastern wall again, probing for weaknesses rather than launching a full assault, the response was slower than it should have been. Orders were given a few moments too late. Positions were held a little too rigidly, without the flexibility Ethan had always instilled in his officers, the understanding that a plan was only a starting point, and that real battles required constant, careful adjustment. No serious harm came of the encounter, but several soldiers were injured, and the raiders retreated with information about the wall's current weaknesses that they would not have gained under the previous leadership. Word of the encounter reached the keep quickly, and with it came a quiet, uncomfortable murmur that spread through the halls faster than any official report. People began to speak Ethan's name again, not with the pity or dismissal that had characterized earlier conversations, but with a kind of reluctant respect, the sort that only comes when someone's absence reveals exactly how much they had been holding together. Charlotte Vane heard the reports in her private study, reading through the details with a growing tightness in her chest that she did not immediately recognize as guilt, having rarely allowed herself to feel it before. She read the casualty list, thankfully short, and the description of the wall's weakened defenses, and she found herself thinking, against her will, of the man who had stood in her hall weeks before and told her, calmly, that he would no longer serve people who saw him as nothing more than a tool. She had told herself, in the days following his departure, that his resignation had been an overreaction, a wounded pride dressed up as principle. She had continued her days as though nothing significant had changed, attending to the rebuilding of the orchard, managing her family's affairs, dismissing the whispers among the staff as nothing more than dramatic gossip that would fade with time. But the reports continued to arrive, each one carrying small signs of strain that had not existed under Ethan's command. Supply lines that had once moved smoothly now faced delays. Morale among the soldiers, which Ethan had always managed to keep steady even during the hardest campaigns, had grown noticeably brittle. Felix Grant was a good officer, everyone agreed, but he was not, and perhaps could never be, what Ethan Cole had been to that company of soldiers. One evening, nearly a month after Ethan's departure, Charlotte summoned Nolan Hart to her study, needing, though she would not have admitted it easily, someone who might help her understand what exactly had gone wrong, and whether it could still be fixed. "The eastern defenses are weaker than they were," she said, without preamble, as Nolan entered the room. "I have read the reports. I know you have seen them as well." "I have," Nolan said, his tone careful and measured, the tone of a man who had chosen his words in advance, anticipating this exact conversation. "Felix is a fine officer, but he is not Ethan, and the soldiers know the difference, even if they cannot always explain it." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, turning a small ornament over in her hands, something she did when she was thinking through a problem she did not enjoy facing. "I want him back," she said finally. Nolan raised an eyebrow slightly, though he had half expected this. "That may not be a simple matter, my lady." Ethan did not leave in anger over a single conversation. He left because he had decided, after years of feeling undervalued, that he no longer wished to serve people who treated him as disposable. Convincing him to return will require more than an official summons. "Then what would it require?" Charlotte asked, and there was something in her voice that Nolan had not heard from her before, an uncertainty that sat uneasily alongside her usual composed authority. "An apology," Nolan said simply. "A real one, not an official letter written by a scribe on your behalf, but something that acknowledges what you actually said to him, and why it mattered as much as it did." Charlotte's jaw tightened slightly, old habits of pride resisting the suggestion, even as some newer, quieter part of her recognized its truth. I am not accustomed to apologizing to soldiers. He is not simply a soldier, Nolan said, his tone firm, despite the respect he maintained for her rank. He held that eastern wall for over a decade. He trained half the officers currently serving this kingdom. He gave up everything he had built, including his own sense of belonging here, because he believed, correctly, that his years of service meant nothing to the people he protected. If you want him back, my lady, you will need to prove that belief wrong, and words spoken from a position of authority will not be enough. He will need to see that you mean it. Charlotte set down the ornament she had been turning over and looked out the window of her study, toward the distant hills where the eastern wall stood, weakened now in ways that had not existed a month before. She thought of the hall, of the satisfaction she had felt watching Ethan absorb her words without flinching, mistaking his silence for weakness rather than the discipline of a man who had learned, through years of hardship, not to give others the reaction they were hoping for. She thought, too, of her grandfather's orchard, burned in the raid that Ethan and his soldiers had ultimately stopped from spreading further, and of how quickly she had blamed him for damage that would have been far worse without his leadership. She had been afraid, she realized slowly, standing there in her study with the weight of the report still fresh in her mind, afraid of owing a debt to a man she had spent years quietly dismissing because of his lack of family name, his lack of the connections and privilege that had always defined her own place in the world. It had been easier to tear him down than to acknowledge how much her family's safety depended on someone she had never considered an equal. "Where is he now?" she asked quietly. "I do not know for certain," Nolan admitted, "but I have heard rumors. A small village to the south, near the river crossing, has taken on a new blacksmith in recent weeks. A man who keeps to himself but works with unusual skill, and who has, on occasion, offered to train the local militia in basic defense. It matches nothing official, but it matches the kind of quiet life a man like Ethan might choose, if he wanted to disappear without truly disappearing." Charlotte was silent for a long moment, weighing the decision before her. Pride whispered that summoning him back through official channels, offering restored rank and increased pay, should be more than sufficient for any soldier to return. But some newer, more honest part of her recognized that pride was precisely what had caused this situation in the first place, and that continuing to rely on it now would only ensure the same mistake repeated itself. "I will go to him myself," she said finally. Nolan's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise this time. "My lady, that is not necessary. A letter, properly worded, delivered by a trusted messenger, would likely—" "No," Charlotte said, more firmly now, something resolving in her expression that had not been there when the conversation began. "I said what I said to his face, in front of everyone. If I owe him anything, I owe him the same courage, spoken directly, without the protection of distance or rank. If he refuses to return, so be it. But I will not send words on a page to fix what I broke with words spoken aloud." Nolan studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his usual careful composure. "Very well," he said. "I will arrange an escort for the journey south." Charlotte shook her head slightly. "No escort. If I arrive with soldiers and banners, it will look like exactly what it is not meant to be, an official summons dressed up as sincerity. I will go alone, or with only the smallest company necessary for the road." The journey south took 4 days, through roads that grew narrower and quieter the further Charlotte traveled from the keep she had spent her entire life within. She had rarely traveled without the comfort of servants and guards surrounding her, and the unfamiliar simplicity of the journey gave her long, uninterrupted hours to think, something she had rarely allowed herself before. She thought of her grandfather, who had built the family's holdings from far less than what she now managed, and who had always spoken of soldiers with genuine respect, a respect she realized, somewhat painfully, she had never fully absorbed from him. She thought of the 11 men who had died holding the eastern wall, men whose names she did not know, whose families she had never once considered visiting or supporting in the aftermath of their loss. She had focused instead on burned fields and damaged orchards, material losses that could be measured and repaired, while dismissing the losses that could never be undone. By the time she reached the small village near the river crossing on the 4th day, tired and dusty from the road in a way she had rarely experienced, something in her understanding of the entire situation had shifted considerably. She was no longer simply seeking to restore a weakened defense line. She was seeking, she realized with some discomfort, to correct something in herself that had been wrong long before that single conversation in the hall had ever taken place. The village was small and unremarkable, a scattering of modest homes surrounding a central square, with a river running along its eastern edge that provided both water and a natural boundary against the wilderness beyond. Charlotte dismounted near the square and asked a passing villager, an older woman carrying a basket of vegetables, where she might find the blacksmith. The woman pointed toward a modest building at the edge of the square, smoke rising steadily from a chimney at its side, the rhythmic sound of hammer against metal, carrying clearly through the quiet afternoon air. Charlotte stood for a long moment at the edge of the square, watching the smoke rise, gathering the courage for a conversation she had never imagined herself needing to have, before finally walking forward toward the sound of the hammer. The heat from the forge reached Charlotte before she even stepped through the open doorway, thick and dry, carrying the sharp smell of hot metal and burning coal. Inside, Ethan Cole stood with his back to her, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hammer rising and falling in a steady rhythm against a glowing piece of iron resting on the anvil before him. He looked different than she remembered him from the hall, weeks ago, simpler, somehow. His hair was slightly longer, his face carried a light coating of soot, and the tension that had always seemed to sit in his shoulders, even in moments of rest, appeared to have loosened, at least slightly. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure how to announce herself, before he finally spoke without turning around. "If you're here about the plow blade, it won't be ready until tomorrow," he said, his tone easy, clearly assuming she was simply another villager, come to check on a commission. "I'm not here about a plow blade," Charlotte said. Ethan's hammer paused mid-swing, hovering above the glowing metal for a moment, before he set it down slowly and turned to face her. Whatever expression he had expected to see when he turned, it was clearly not the sight of Charlotte Vane standing in the doorway of his modest forge, dressed simply for travel, without the usual finery and authority that had always surrounded her in the keep. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The forge crackled quietly behind him, the only sound in the sudden, heavy silence between them. "My lady," Ethan finally said, his voice carefully neutral, though Charlotte could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "I did not expect to see you here." "I imagine not," Charlotte said. She glanced around the modest space, the tools hanging neatly along the walls, the half-finished projects resting on various surfaces, evidence of a life quietly and deliberately rebuilt from nothing. "May I speak with you? Not as a lady addressing a soldier. Simply as myself, speaking to you." Ethan studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to allow the conversation at all. Finally, he set down his tools entirely and gestured toward a bench near the forge's entrance, a small, worn seat that had clearly seen better days. "You may speak," he said. "I cannot promise I will have much interest in what you say, but I will listen." Charlotte sat, arranging her travel-worn skirts with more care than the moment probably required, using the small action to gather her thoughts before beginning. Ethan remained standing, arms crossed, watching her with the same careful, guarded expression he had worn since she first arrived. "The Eastern Wall has struggled since your departure," she began, deciding honesty was the only reasonable starting point. "Felix Grant is a capable officer, but he is not you, and the soldiers feel that difference keenly. There was an encounter with raiders 3 weeks ago. No lives were lost, but several soldiers were injured, and the wall's weaknesses were exposed in ways that would not have happened under your command." "I am sorry to hear soldiers were injured," Ethan said, and his tone carried genuine sincerity, despite the distance he clearly still held toward her. "But I fail to see what that has to do with me. I no longer hold command over that wall. That was my choice, and I do not regret it." "I know," Charlotte said, "and I have come to understand, over these past weeks, exactly why you made that choice. I have thought a great deal about what I said to you in the hall, Ethan. I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, and I have come to recognize it for exactly what it was. Cruelty, dressed up as honesty, an attack disguised as criticism." Ethan's expression did not soften immediately, though something in his posture shifted slightly, a small crack in the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival. "Why now?" he asked. "Why the sudden reflection? after weeks of silence. Charlotte took a slow breath, choosing her next words carefully, knowing that anything less than complete honesty would likely be recognized immediately and dismissed. "Because losing you revealed something I was not prepared to see," she admitted. "I told myself, in the days after you left, that your departure was simply wounded pride, an overreaction to a difficult conversation. It was easier to believe that than to accept what I actually knew to be true, which is that everything I said to you that day came from my own fear, rather than any genuine assessment of your worth." "Fear of what?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, genuine curiosity replacing some of the guarded distance. "Fear of owing a debt I could not repay with anything, except my pride," Charlotte said, the words coming slowly, as though she were examining them for the first time, even as she spoke them aloud. "My family has always measured worth in land and lineage, in names that carry weight simply by existing. You came from nothing, by those standards, and yet you had already given more to protect what my family owns than anyone in my bloodline has given in generations. That should have earned my respect. Instead, it threatened something in me, some belief that our worth was tied to birth rather than action, and rather than examine that belief honestly, I chose to attack you instead, because it was easier than admitting I might be wrong." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had said, clearly unprepared for the depth of honesty in her explanation. He had expected, if she came at all, some official apology crafted by advisors, some careful arrangement of words, designed to secure his return without genuinely addressing what had happened. This was something else entirely. 11 men died holding that wall," he said finally. "I have thought of them every day since I left. I did not walk away because I stopped caring about this kingdom's safety. I walked away because I could no longer bear serving people who saw those deaths, and my own years of sacrifice, as simply the cost of doing business, unworthy of even basic gratitude." "I know," Charlotte said, "and I cannot undo what I said, or the pain it caused you. I can only tell you now, honestly and directly, that I was wrong. Your worth was never measured by your birth or your name. It was measured, all along, by the 11 men who trusted you enough to follow you into danger, by the soldiers who still speak your name with respect even now, weeks after you left, by the very fact that this kingdom has struggled without your leadership in ways that prove exactly how much you were carrying, quietly, without ever asking for recognition." Ethan looked away for a moment, out through the open doorway toward the village square, where the ordinary rhythms of daily life continued undisturbed by the conversation unfolding within the forge. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I built a life here," he said. "A small one, but an honest one. The villagers do not know or care about my history. They simply see a blacksmith who does good work and occasionally offers to teach their young people how to defend themselves if raiders ever come this far south. There is a peace in that, Charlotte, that I never found in all my years of service at the keep." "I am not here to demand you return," Charlotte said quietly. "I came because I owed you an apology spoken honestly, to your face, the same way my cruelty was delivered. Whatever you decide after hearing it is entirely your choice, and I will respect it, whatever it may be." Ethan studied her for a long moment, searching her expression for any sign of the calculated composure she had worn in the hall weeks before. Any hint that this apology was simply another form of strategic manipulation designed to secure something she wanted. He found none. What he saw instead was something closer to genuine humility, uncomfortable and unfamiliar on a face that had rarely, in his experience, allowed itself to show vulnerability of any kind. "I appreciate the honesty," he said finally. "More than you likely realize, but I do not think I can simply return to my old life, Charlotte. Too much has changed, in me if nowhere else. I have found something here that I was never able to find in all my years of service, a sense of belonging that does not depend on proving my worth over and over to people who will always, at some level, see me as less than themselves." Charlotte nodded slowly, disappointment flickering across her face despite her attempt to hide it, though she did not argue or push further, having promised herself before the journey that she would respect whatever decision he made. "I understand," she said. "I will not pretend the Eastern defenses will not miss your leadership, but I respect your choice, and I am grateful you allowed me to speak honestly, even if it changes nothing about your decision." She rose from the bench, preparing to leave, when Ethan spoke again, something thoughtful in his tone that had not been there a moment before. "I did not say I would do nothing," he said. "I said I would not return to my old life." "There is a difference." Charlotte paused, watching him carefully. "I would be willing to help train the militia here more formally," Ethan continued, "and perhaps, on occasion, advise your commanders on strategy, from a distance, on my own terms. Not as a soldier under your command, but as someone choosing, freely, to share what I know, because it matters to me that this kingdom remains safe, even if I no longer wish to serve within its walls, in the way I once did." Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest, a relief she had not expected to feel this strongly. "That would mean a great deal," she said. "To the soldiers, and to me personally." "I have conditions," Ethan said, and there was the faintest hint of something like humor in his tone now, the first she had seen since her arrival. "I will not wear that armor again, not in the way I once did. I will not stand in your hall and be spoken to as though my sacrifices mean nothing. If I offer my knowledge, it will be offered as an equal, not as a tool to be picked up and discarded when convenient." "Agreed," Charlotte said, without hesitation. "Entirely agreed." They spoke for a while longer, working out the practical details of what this new arrangement might look like, and as the conversation continued, something between them shifted slowly from the careful distance of the morning into something closer to genuine mutual respect. Charlotte stayed in the village that evening, at Ethan's suggestion, taking a room at the small local inn, rather than attempting the journey home before nightfall, and the following morning, before she departed, she walked through the village square one final time, watching Ethan work at his forge, a man who had built, quietly and deliberately, a life defined by his own terms, rather than the expectations of others. As she rode north back toward the keep, Charlotte found herself thinking, not for the first time in recent weeks, about the true measure of a person's worth. She had spent her entire life believing that worth was inherited, carried in bloodlines and titles, in names that opened doors simply by existing. Ethan Cole had shown her something different, though not through any single dramatic gesture. He had shown her through years of quiet service that meant everything to the people who depended on him, through a decision to walk away rather than continue accepting treatment he did not deserve, and through the calm, deliberate way he had chosen his own path afterward, rather than allowing anyone else, including her, to define it for him. Word of Charlotte's journey south eventually spread through the keep, though the details remained mostly private between the two of them. What became clear to everyone, over the following months, was that the eastern defenses grew steadily stronger again, with occasional visits from a quiet former commander who trained officers and advised on strategy, without ever formally returning to his old rank. The soldiers who had served under him welcomed these visits eagerly, and slowly, a new kind of respect grew between Ethan Cole and the kingdom he had once nearly abandoned entirely. A respect built not on obligation or hierarchy, but on genuine, mutual acknowledgement of what he had given, and what he still chose to give, freely, on his own terms. Charlotte Vane, for her part, became known in the years that followed as someone who listened more carefully than she once had, who measured the people around her by their actions rather than their birth, and who never again allowed pride to silence an apology that needed to be spoken. And Ethan Cole, in the small village near the river crossing, continued his work at the forge, training the local militia in his quiet, patient way, occasionally traveling north to offer counsel when it was needed, always returning afterward to the modest life he had built for himself, a life where his worth had never needed proving to anyone, least of all himself. He had learned, in the end, that true strength was never found in armor or rank, in titles earned through years of relentless effort to belong somewhere that had never fully welcomed him. It was found instead in the quiet certainty of knowing his own value, a certainty that no cruel word, however precisely aimed, could ever again take away from him,